Hello, and welcome to this episode of the WARC Podcast. My name is Paul Stringer, and I'm the Managing Editor of Research and Insights at WARC. Now, today, I'm really excited because we're going to be talking about the future of media 2025. That's the title of a new report that is out now on the WARC platform, and it looks at some of the biggest trends that are set to shape media planning and the wider ecosystem this year. Now, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Billy Ryan, who is Head of Analytics and Effectiveness at the UK's biggest independent media agency, the 7stars. And actually, Billy provided inspiration for the first trend of the report, which I'll get onto shortly. Before we talk to Billy, though, let's hear a quick word from WARC Advisory.
Being a marketer isn't easy. You're constantly seeking buy-in for your ideas, defending your strategy, and looking for opportunities to do things better. To succeed, you need to inspire confidence and drive belief. The good news? You don't have to do it alone. When you partner with WARC, the global authority on marketing effectiveness, we provide the data and strategic insights needed to build the boldness your business deserves. Visit warc.com/advisory to learn more.
Billy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here.
We've got lots to discuss today. In the report itself, there are three main trends, and I want to kick off with what is probably the biggest one, which is what we're calling planning in an age of abundance. And I think I've mentioned this elsewhere. We did use this phrase abundance. It came from you. It was a phrase that you coined to really offer a slightly more optimistic take on the phenomenon of media fragmentation. So before we dive properly into this trend, I'd love to hear your perspective on what planning in an age of abundance means to you.
Yeah, you're right. The flip from fragmentation to abundance very much came from a discomfort with that fragmentation word. You know, that there's nothing inaccurate about fragmentation. It characterizes what's going on in the media landscape. Consumers are spending time with a broader range of channels, but I always looked at it as a very kind of planner agency centric word. You know, it describes the management challenge of today's media landscape, but not the effectiveness opportunity within that landscape. So when you view it from an advertiser's perspective, or even from a consumer's perspective, fragmentation is kind of a silly word. It doesn't really resonate. For a consumer of media or a marketer with an ad budget, it's an age of abundance, right? When you look at everything in the round, time spent with media, particularly video, it's in growth, right? In the UK, it's up 16% since lockdown. And while there was a period in the 2010s when, newer media and e-commerce businesses didn't really fully embrace advertising. I think the cheap money era was probably partly responsible for that. That's kind of flipped 180 since the pandemic, since things like the rise of Amazon ads and Walmart and what that's done for those businesses. Right now businesses are really falling over themselves to launch different advertising propositions. Not all of them are perfect, right? Some of them represent really good value, some of them less so. But I think the sheer volume and the sheer enthusiasm behind those advertising products means that competitive pressure will create effectiveness opportunities for advertisers, even if they're not necessarily all there right now.
That's really interesting. And I think just to pick up on a couple of things you said there and start to unpick this a bit more. In the report, we talk about a couple of interesting trends around media abundance and based on that idea, which is that it seems we've kind of moved past this slightly challenging phase where advertisers were learning to use digital media effectively, and we've moved out of the phase of only treating digital media as kind of direct response channels. That's kind of one trend. And the other trend is that there is just more high quality brand safe media available than ever before. Does that kind of chime with your assessment of where we are with media at the moment?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the video landscape is much healthier than it was, say, 5-6 years ago, it was very difficult to find high quality video impacts outside of linear TV and outside of, what were then fairly nascent broadcaster video on demand propositions. But, with the streaming platforms moving into video, with the rise of the streaming platforms moving into to advertising, and the rise of short form video and integration of short form video ads into that, it's a much kind of healthier place in terms of finding those high quality video impacts.
So on the subject of integration, there's lots of evidence out there, right, that when you add more channels to the media mix, you tend to drive bigger effects. And some of that comes from synergies between different channels. There was a really interesting piece that was written by Dr. Grace Kite on this phenomenon. And she was making the argument that in the current way we approach media planning, you basically need to be thinking about how lots of different channels combine together to add up to something bigger. And it's a kind of new approach to brand building where we can't really rely on one channel to capture the audience's attention for 30 seconds plus, maybe television, but it's kind of declining in terms of reach and relevance for certain portions of the audience. So she made this argument that there is a kind of lots of little approach to brand building that is emerging where you're capturing 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds of attention from audiences across lots of different platforms, based on the idea that this kind of critical mass of smaller exposures might add up to something bigger and more meaningful. And I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Grace is absolutely on the money. Lots of little is the natural antidote to media fragmentation. I'd probably add a couple of things to that. Synergy is an outcome of media planning, right? You achieve that when you understand the kind of nuance and variety within today's advertising landscape, right? When you take that opportunity to plan for specific outcomes from your media buy, to move specific metrics over specific time horizons. So kind of how you go about planning your media to achieve those synergies is really, really important. The other challenge with lots of little is making sure those lots of little ladder up to a coherent whole. For example, there's a tension between, the tech companies telling us about the importance of assets being fit for platform and having lots of creative variants to feed the algorithm. But this can sometimes kind of jar with the market level work of System 1 and others that show consistency and having discipline around distinctive brand assets is vital to achieving creative effectiveness. So lots of little is the way forward, but operationalizing it's not just about kind of creating lots of different assets for different formats. What's more important is kind of carefully considering how you balance that tension between platform best practice, which is only ever rooted in the signals that those platforms see, with the fundamental principles of creative effectiveness, which tend to be rooted in higher integrity effectiveness data. On the lots of little point, I guess I very much agree with Grace's direction of travel, but I think it is important when we're talking about the future of media to say that big still matters. And if anything, if brands can still achieve big in a lots of little world, they're going to stand out even more, right? The challenge, of course, is big is much harder to achieve. And what it requires is a level of kind of creativity and innovation in both, not just media planning, but also media trading in order to achieve that, right? We don't have the get out of jail free card of appointment to view TV anymore. So the best agencies will start to work with media owners, not just to drive the best cost per for their client, but actually elevate their partnership with those media owners, because that's how you unlock the biggest standout opportunities in their estate and still achieve big in media in that world of fragmented lots of littles.
That's really interesting. I think it's a really important nuance, because something I was kind of at pains to point out in the report is that, when we're having these kind of debates in media, the fashionable thing to do is just argue very hard for one side or the other. But of course, we live in a world of plurality where you can big campaigns still matter, a lots of little approach matters too. I think, as you say, the direction of travel seems to be lots of little, but that isn't to kind of discount the importance of channels like television or cinema, you name it. I think that a lot of the established effectiveness research out there tells us that actually advertisers are massively over-invested in some of those platforms where that kind of champion a lots of little approach, right? And actually should be scaling back some of that investment and putting it into those established workhorse channels like television and cinema, where you can still have those big brand-driven, highly emotional, high attention-grabbing campaigns. I just wanted to finish because you mentioned something very interesting about algorithms and how the best practice on platforms, particularly the social media platforms, is increasingly being driven by machine learning algorithms, which are kind of dictating in some way what success looks like for campaigns on those platforms. And certainly when we're looking at trends in media spending, you can see more and more spend is shifting to the platforms like the Metas and the TikToks of the world that have made big investments in AI, where campaigns are increasingly automated and algorithms play an enormous role in determining advertising success. And I just wanted to get your opinion, Billy, on how you approach that challenge and how you think about working with algorithms in a productive way and working with clients to kind of manage this challenge.
It's a really big shift, and it's really important that you guys have pulled that out and made it so prominent in the report. I think there's a really interesting section in the profitability to work by ThinkBox. So for people that aren't familiar with it, it's a meta-analysis of econometric studies in the UK over the last kind of 3 or 4 years. And there's a chapter kind of buried towards the end of quite a lengthy paper that talks about variance in returns to different media channels. So the kind of key chart ranks different media channels based on risk, right? So based on the range of ROI outcomes observed across the brands in the study. And on that chart, you can basically draw a line down the middle between channels that are governed by joint industry currencies of old and those that are increasingly governed by algorithms. And this isn't me having a go at channels that are governed by algorithms. You can create absolutely brilliant outcomes for brands within those platforms and create a huge amount of economic value. But when those algorithms are kind of left unfettered, they can create unintended consequences like cannibalizing the base, for example. So, algorithms are here to stay. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that, we need to be much more careful and considered in how we use them relative to when we were planning channels that had joint industry currencies associated with them, right? So the planners of today, you have to deeply probe and analyze the mechanics of the different formats that they're using, right? So, we know what the intended consequence of those formats are, but we don't always know what the unintended consequences are. And things like geotests can be really helpful in that regard, right? It's a great way to understand what channels like brand PPC or Performance Max are driving on a direct basis, but also what second order effects they might be having on direct traffic, for example.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think one of the recommendations we make in the report to kind of mitigate against being too over invested in any one platform is to make sure that you've got a diverse portfolio of media properties that you're investing in, right? And I think diversity is one way to countenance some of those challenges. And, as you've made the argument, and as the title of this trend suggests, we're in an abundant media environment. And yes, more and more spend seems to be flowing to some of those big tech platforms, but also there's new and interesting opportunities emerging across the media landscape with independent media and advertising in smaller, spaces and places that maybe attract less absolute reach or less mass audiences, but still offer interesting opportunities for advertisers. Okay, so trend number 2 is what we call the rewiring of search. And we're calling it the rewiring of search because search is potentially undergoing the biggest transformation it's experienced for at least a couple of decades. We're seeing search changing in a couple of interesting ways. One is that, yes, Google absolutely still has a monopoly on search advertising, but search behavior is fragmenting across social platforms and also retail platforms. So we've seen, TikTok has become a really important site of discovery. Amazon, you're getting product searches taking place there all the time, actually sometimes outstripping product searches on Google. And then the second big transformation in search is, of course, the growing impact of AI. We can see that with AI summaries being delivered when you're doing Google searches, but also with the growth of companies like Perplexity or ChatGPT and other things like that. So just curious to get your thoughts, Billy, on search fragmentation, how it's kind of impacting your approach to media planning, but also how it might be impacting advertiser budgets as well.
Yeah, it's a hugely interesting trend. And I think in the round, it's a hugely positive development for advertisers, right? It means more competition. It means richer search and discovery formats, which can only lead to good outcomes in the long term. I think you're right to kind of recognize that it is, it is still a very Google-centric landscape at the moment. I think it's, if we park retail media for a moment, I think it's quite early days in terms of how it impacts budgets and even how it impacts the performance of more traditional search campaigns. Monetization of those new search frontiers is really nascent, and I think there's quite an important distinction between the kind of conversational queries that we all now punch into ChatGPT, and the more kind of commercial intent type queries that we still tend to put into the search bar. Google and Microsoft are very good at identifying this and protecting those existing search formats that work really well for advertisers. But, there are areas where it has changed quite a bit. So I think shopping ads, right, that's something that has been quite quickly taken over by Google Performance Max, for example. And that might kind of indicate what the broader direction of travel is within search, right? Products like PMax, right, they're AI-driven, they're much more automated than the search buying of old, right? There's less granular control on how the channel is executed. So I think what that means for search teams is, they're beginning to focus further up the value chain, right? They're building a better understanding of the macro business priorities of their clients, and they're focusing on, lifetime value optimization, delivering the right business at the right time for their clients. When we talked about planning in the age of in the age of abundance, we talked about how important the planning discipline was becoming. But another side to that is teams that were previously quite focused on buying and execution, are now having to think much more like planners to navigate the variety of different media options that are at their disposal. So I'm really kind of excited by what's going on in the search space. I think it is probably still in a test and learn phase, but there's really kind of positive intent from the new players in the search market as regards advertising. So yeah, very, very exciting time to be in that space.
Yeah, and intent is the appropriate word, isn't it? Our very own David Tiltman wrote a really good piece on this shift from information to intent when it comes to how AI is reshaping search, and also how basically there is this kind of battle going on between the different search players to prove that they are more sophisticated than their competitors in being able to identify user intent in more and more granular ways. I think one of the interesting ways that is showing up is also around the AI outputs themselves, right? Which is there is this kind of battle to service intent with the most relevant content, advertising, you name it. And I think there's potentially a challenge there for advertisers in making sure that when their brands appear in AI output, first of all, it's kind of they're represented favorably, but also that their products and services are achieving good visibility when those kinds of high intent searches happen, and that they can be that their products or services can kind of be delivered to satisfy that intent. So I wondered what your thoughts were on optimizing for AI search outputs, and whether this is a kind of nascent area, whether you're starting to think about it with clients, and what some of those consequences are for adapting to a world where algorithms determine so much of what we see online.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably two important elements to that. I think the first one is, how brands show up in generative AI output. I think it's really it's a new frontier for SEO, right? It is there is a discipline developing there to analyze the outputs that are being generated and kind of reverse engineer what is driving those outputs, right? Really, that's just a reframing of the SEO discipline. I think there's maybe a wider kind of point around digital availability. We'll probably come on and talk about commerce and retail media in a moment, but I think we need to much more systematically measure how brands are showing up in digital commerce environments, right, over and above those paid media placements, right? We know from decades working with CPG advertisers how important distribution and prominence is in driving outcomes, but it's a relatively new frontier in terms of measuring the availability of products in the digital space. So I think that's a really important area for brands and agencies to focus on how that is measured, because it's going to be a really powerful growth and penetration driver for brands in the future.
So trend number 3, which we call in the report commerce everywhere. And the point of this really is that we are fast moving to a media ecosystem where every single touch point is basically becoming shoppable, and it's easier to link purchase data with exposures in particular environments. And there's kind of three trends that are driving this shift towards commerce everywhere. First of all, retail platforms are beginning to move up the funnel. So, Amazon, Walmart, some of those big retail giants are beginning to offer brand advertising opportunities, upper funnel advertising opportunities. We've also seen new commerce media entrants like Uber, United Airlines, Chase Bank begin to monetize their customer data and start selling advertising within their own kind of ad networks. And then, of course, we've also seen the rapid growth of social commerce. I mean, it's already incredibly well established in regions like Asia, but it's also starting to have more of an impact in other markets and regions in the West as well. So would just love to get your thoughts, Billy, on the rise of commerce media and kind of what role it plays in campaigns at the moment for you and your clients.
Yeah, I mean, I think commerce media, the development of those ad propositions that you mentioned, I think that's probably the defining attribute of the age of abundance, right? We've had a total mindset shift around the sell side advertising opportunity among businesses, which is which is a brilliant thing for the industry in the round. There's negatives. I think when retail media first emerged, there was a lot of pushback, probably from myself included, in terms of brands having to pay to play in e-commerce where previously they didn't have to. But I think if you look at how physical retail has worked for years, I think the emergence of pay-to-play listings, that was always an inevitability within those platforms. I think the landscape that we're in now is very exciting for advertisers, because you're moving from a world where availability was driven by relationships and often quite complex deal making, into a world where availability is much more dynamic, much more biddable. So it allows you to be much more considered and targeted in terms of who you're showing up in front of, who you're showing up against. So it's a really interesting space where I think share starts to come up for grabs in categories where previously consumer habits were quite rigid and difficult to shift. So yeah, it's really interesting space.
Yeah, and I think just picking up on that trend you mentioned, we've seen a shift from that kind of relationship with retailers being managed by these quite siloed shopper marketing teams to being actually part of the responsibility of the marketing team. You can see that traditional kind of brand marketers are getting more involved in managing those commerce relationships and thinking, like you say, about availability in all of these different environments, which is becoming, like you say, much more dynamic. I think the one of the concerns that we've seen bubble up around this trend, though, is how budgets are shifting as a result of the growth of commerce media. So there was a report from IAB Europe, as well as the ANA over in the States, that basically showed that more of the budgets that are meant for kind of traditional brand advertising are now being used to fund commerce media. So we're seeing money being taken away from channels like television to pay for commerce advertising. And I just wanted to get your kind of thoughts on that trend. Is that something you're seeing as well?
Yeah, that does resonate. Unfortunately, they really should be seen as kind of different things. When we were on the previous topic, right? We talked about commerce media as really distribution, place, availability, and it's exciting that lever is kind of coming back into the marketing remit. But the flip side of that, I guess, is those commerce media opportunities are being positioned against brand advertising opportunities. The toothpaste is kind of out of the tube in terms of commerce listings being labeled as advertising. So businesses and finance departments will inevitably see them as drawing from the same pot. I think how you overcome that is to try and tackle the measurement asymmetries between brand and performance. So the multiplier report that you guys put out a couple of weeks ago, brilliantly describes the data sets, the measurement methodologies that can lure brands into that kind of advertising doom loop of moving budget from brand to performance. It's exactly the same challenge with commerce media. So it's really important that brands rethink their effectiveness measurement programs for this new environment that we're in. So things like market mix modeling and things like experiments, they do help and they have a really important role to play. But, we also have to recognize some of the challenges within those. So fragmentation across all of those platforms, right? That is an existential challenge for MMM. So, often the solution is actually in working with those platforms to access that, highly granular data that they have at their disposal, right? So the geographic data that Amazon can make available is really, really interesting and exciting, for example, and that allows you to evaluate those different opportunities in the round and make sure you're not getting drawn into any of those unintended consequences that we spoke about earlier in the podcast.
Yeah, I think That's a really good point, and making sure that, we don't over focus on metrics like ROAS when we're trying to understand the impact of our investments in commerce. Of course, there's the one of the simplest things to do is to make sure that we're protecting those budgets that are meant for traditional brand building advertising. I also think that there is an onus on advertisers to start thinking more about brand building within commerce environments. So we talk about this in the report, things like making sure that you're using distinctive assets, so you kind of stand out in these very cluttered environments, making sure that you are thinking about what the experience for the consumer is like in commerce. It tends to be one of those areas that you don't see brands put a huge amount of thought into necessarily. So there's an opportunity there as well. Is there any other brand building strategies or ways you're thinking about brand in commerce and how to kind of protect that or enhance brand equity when it seems all of the pressure and it is about driving those short-term results?
Yeah, I think you've highlighted the challenge and the opportunity really, really well there. I think because these formats are, often kind of biddable auction-based formats, there is a tendency to kind of treat them the way how we treated traditional paid search campaigns. But they're much more visual. There's many more levers that you can use in that environment to build a brand. And like kind of like what I said earlier, when commerce was taking place in physical locations, it was the way that brands showed up, the brands that were listed in those environments was really rigid. So it was very difficult to move share. But there's so many more flexible levers that are available in those digital commerce environments now. There's just huge reward to brands putting a concerted effort into how they merchandise their brands in those environments. So it's much more nuanced than simply getting to the top of a kind of high intent generic search query.
Well, that pretty much wraps us up for today. But just before we close, Billy, any final thoughts you wanted to add on some of the trends set to shape media this year? Any of the conversation we had, has it kind of sparked any other thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big focus for the year ahead is finding the right feedback loops for the age of abundance, right? And how does measurement need to evolve for, shall I call it, the WARC era of brand multiplied by performance? Such as the success of your recent report. I think the metrics that served us well in the past won't necessarily serve us well in the future. Things like 1+ reach and share of voice, they were really effective in an era of TV dominance, but era of abundance really deprecates those measures, right? So you guys have covered the work of Professor Felipe Tomas before, who talks about media channel units being non-fungible. There's also the tracking challenge of share of voice that brands and agencies need to deal with, and the challenge of fragmentation in market mix as well. So I think 2025, it's about how agencies and advertisers can integrate new metrics into the effectiveness equation. So attention has an important role. The cross-channel reach initiatives have a role. Improving, how we design market mix models all has a role, but really it's how you use them all together to create a plan that takes advantage of the age of abundance, that plans for synergies and what we talked about earlier. That's where the value really is for me.
Brilliant. That's really insightful. Thank you. And for our listeners, just a reminder that the Future of Media report is live on the WARC site, so do go check that out if you want to read more on the topics that we've discussed today. But that's it for this episode of the WARC Podcast. If you like what you've heard, please do follow us on your favourite podcasting platform. And if you really liked it, please do leave us a review. Until next time, thanks for listening.